Well, sadly, loss is an inescapable part of life, and the resulting grief and emotional pain can't just be wished away. It doesn't matter whether you're experiencing the physical death of someone you love, the loss of a relationship through divorce or some sort of breakup, the loss of a dream, the loss of a job, or any other kind of loss. Grief is a normal and necessary part of our healing process, which is why every culture around the world has rituals to help us deal with mourning and grief and to mark transitions. But our North American culture has steadily downplayed mourning rituals of all kinds until they're, quite frankly, practically non-existent. We prefer to try to hide death, both physical and metaphorical, and to try to pretend that it doesn't really happen. Even funerals are no longer seen as a time for us to mourn our loss, but to celebrate the life. And while it's good to remember all that was good about a loved one, it doesn't take away our need to mourn their loss from our life. And tragically, more and more often, the funeral is just eliminated altogether. I'm always deeply saddened when people tell me that they can't have a memorial service for a now deceased loved one because they said they didn't want a funeral. They didn't want anyone crying over them. I always think that that's an absolutely terrible and incredibly selfish thing to do to your family and friends, as if somehow not allowing them to have a formal chance to say goodbye will prevent them from feeling sad that you're dead. Our culture tries to treat death as something to be dealt with as quickly as possible so we can move on. The thought seems to be that if you could just skip over those few days or weeks of mourning, then you just don't have to feel sad at all. But it doesn't work that way. I think it's tragic that we have lost the ancient art of lament. And I think we need to relearn it. Today's Old Testament passage is David's lament over the death of King Saul and Saul's son, Jonathan. Now, this lament is an extraordinary piece of literature, and I think it would be fabulous if we could create such a beautiful piece of poetry for every funeral. In this poem, David expresses his deep grief over the deaths and his undying love for his friend Jonathan. But I think the really interesting thing about this lament for King Saul is that David is lamenting him at all. If we had actually read the chapters that precede today's text, you'd be surprised that David isn't celebrating Saul's death, because David is grieving here for a man who has tried to kill him on numerous occasions. But David clearly had a very high theology of the role of an anointed king, and he believed that no human should lift his hand against God's chosen king. And to give David his due, despite his numerous, very dubious actions during his time as king in waiting, he refused to kill Saul, even when he did have chances to do so. According to the narrator, it was Saul who'd grown increasingly mentally unstable, paranoid, and jealous of David's military skill and popularity. So in his lament, David gives Saul his due as a king who, despite his faults, still did great things for Israel. Now, on the other hand, there is no surprise at all about David's genuine, deep grief over the loss of his friend Jonathan. Well, there are always some people who speculate whether or not David and Jonathan had a sexual relationship. The truth is we don't, and we can't know one way or the other. And really, it doesn't matter. But what is clear is that theirs was a relationship of great depth. Jonathan, despite being Saul's eldest son and heir, and therefore the one with the most to lose from David's popularity, consistently supported David. 3 times, Jonathan made a covenant with David, and 3 times he saved David's life by warning him of Saul's intention to kill him. We're told that in his covenant, Jonathan's soul, or the word can be translated as life, is bound to the soul of David, and he loves David as he loves his own life. This love is clearly reciprocated when David declares Jonathan's love as surpassing the love of a woman, which is probably intended as a metaphor to try to express the depth of their relationship and its closeness. In a very real sense, David has lost his soulmate, the one he could share both laughter and tears with, joy and sorrow, the person who stood by him through thick and thin. This was a relationship that could bear all the emotions that life brings. And so David laments. Like our best human relationships, our relationship with God also needs to be big enough and deep enough to survive all the myriad of emotions we encounter in life. The Old Testament shows a healthy understanding of grief and all the various ways that people deal with it. And it shows God as being able to hear and accept the whole range of human emotions: anger, joy, sorrow, trust, blame, revenge, questioning God, asking why. All these and more are acceptable to God. I think we've forgotten that the whole range of emotion, including lament, is a natural part, a healthy part of our relationship, both with God and with each other. God doesn't expect us to be constantly happy and upbeat, nor is God Donald Trump constantly demanding our praise and affirmation. There are times in our lives when we need to weep or to shake our fist at God and rage at life's unfairness. Like a true friend, like a soulmate, God is still with us, even when we cry out in anger or pain or blame. God is able to take our anger and rage. Maybe your anger is justified and maybe it's not, but either way, God is still with you. So it's okay to take all our emotions to God. It's important to lament and to mourn when life is painful. Just as a deep and authentic relationship with another person requires honesty and emotional depth, so too does our relationship with God. If we limit our relationship with God to just praising God or asking for what you want, then it's going to be a very stunted relationship. You have to be able to take everything to God, both good and bad. And so as people of faith, we need to create a church where death and loss can be faced, and our grief, and yes, sometimes our anger at God can be safely expressed. David's lament reminds us not to move away from our pain too quickly, when something bad happens. Grief is normal and natural, but we need to remember that it's not the final word. David grieved deeply over the death of Jonathan, but he didn't stay there. He didn't get stuck in it. God was still at work in his life, and David still had life and work to do. The promise of God is not ever that nothing bad will happen. God doesn't promise us we won't experience pain and loss, but that death and loss aren't the end of the story. There will be healing, whether in this life or the next. The God who calls us to follow also calls us into deep and true relationship amid the ambiguities and the ups and downs of life. Like David, we can lament our losses, shake our fist at God when we need to, and then continue to walk in love and friendship with the God who loves us and who asks for honest relationship in return.